Chatfuel School is now in session. Welcome to our weekly class where the Chatfuel team and the top experts in the industry will cover the most important topics you need to know as a chatbot builder and marketer. I'm Andrew, Chatfuel's head of video production.
And I'm Alex, Chatfuel's product manager.
In 2019, the travel industry contributed a record $8.8 trillion and 319 million jobs to the world economy. More people were traveling than ever before, and economies across the globe were reaping the benefits. But of course, the coronavirus pandemic that began early this year changed all of that. Travel spending in the US alone is projected to drop by 45% this year. International travel spending will drop by 75%. COVID-19 has caused over $250 billion in cumulative losses for the US travel economy alone. And what's more, there's no clear end in sight for this large-scale disruption of the global industry. For the foreseeable future, both leisure and business travel are pretty much off the table. So, how are businesses in this space reacting and responding? What are their plans for the future? We brought in two guests from the travel marketing sector to share their perspectives with us. But before we hear from them, we have another Chatfuel team member, Alex, who's standing in for my co-host Yelena this week. So Alex, will you tell us more about the guests for today's episode?
Well, Andrew, we've got two fascinating guests lined up today. Both of them have decades of experience in the travel industry, either for their own businesses or for their agency's clients. First, we'll hear from Brian Del Monte. He's the president of the Aviation Agency, which is a full-service digital marketing agency that specializes in aviation. Then we'll talk to Susan Friedenberg, who is the CEO of Corporate Flight Attendant Training and Consulting. Susan used to be a corporate flight attendant, meaning she travels the globe with executives, celebrities, and world leaders on private planes. Now she owns a company that teaches others how to land the dream jump too. So, to get started, Andrew will tell us more about Brian and his story.
Right, so as we heard, Brian is currently the president of the Aviation Agency, and he's had a pretty interesting career leading up to this too. For starters, he worked in the Pentagon for 5 years, but his marketing career began in 2004 when he founded Del Monte Agency. There, one of his major accomplishments was growing a brand from $1 million in revenue to $15 million in just 3 years. Fast forward to 2018, and that's when Brian founded the Aviation Agency, which does marketing for airports, companies that make navigation systems for planes, and many, many other clients. And here's a travel-related fun fact for you about Brian. He once sat next to Steve Carell on a flight from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles shortly after Carell starred in the film Evan Almighty. So, let's get some of Brian's insights on the topic of travel marketing during COVID. The first tip he shared with us actually applies to businesses in any industry, and that is, don't stop advertising.
And I know a lot of businesses are doing this, but pulling back on your advertising, canceling, pausing, all that stuff, a simple question I have for you is this. If you think you're going to be in business by the end of the year, then you can't take your foot off the gas. Because time and time again, history demonstrates one rule. Those that advertise during economic downtimes grow and survive, and those that pull back usually don't.
One travel business I've seen that's following Brian's advice is Norwegian Cruise Line. They're actively running Facebook ads that offer a discount if you book a future trip right now. It's an interesting tactic because they're not focusing on COVID or safety with their marketing. Instead, they're tapping into the human desire to get a deal and save money. It's exactly what our guest Donnie mentioned in our recent episode on copywriting, which we'll link in the description. He pointed out that you can get people to take action when you tap into their feelings about money and personal finances. Norwegian Cruise Lines is not taking their foot off the gas, like Brian said. In fact, they seem to be doubling down on their marketing. They're running another campaign right now that focuses on the cruise destinations they're offering for the fall. Even though their next cruise doesn't leave until October, they're already highlighting all these beautiful places to try and get people to book. This approach taps into people's sense of FOMO and builds anticipation and optimism for a hopefully brighter travel future. Here's one of these ads highlighting the Bahamas. We'll be back in 30 seconds.
I mean, it's pretty hard to resist. After being quarantined in our homes for months, the idea of swimming in crystal clear waters with those cute little pigs in that warm tropical sun is pretty appealing. As Alex said, this campaign focuses on optimism and a better future rather than addressing people's fears. However, Brian tells us that addressing fears about the future of the travel industry in general has been a key part of his business's pandemic response. He's been focusing on helping his clients take the budgets they had allocated for in-person trade shows and shift them to other strategies that can help them generate revenue right now. It's just one way he's helped his clients handle the fears about the future of their businesses.
I've had a lot of calls from businesses who go, how are we going to sell? It's not uncommon for these businesses to get a third to half their revenues from trade show activities. So they're freaking out, which is why we made that ad. Now, is it, coronavirus based, if you will? Yeah. But it's also empathetically understanding of what prospects are most worried in. As I joke, I like to say I sleep with all my clients. Obviously, it's an intentionally provocative statement. But what I go on to explain is I know what keeps them up at night. Those things that keep the client up at night, that keep the prospect up at night, that's what you need to be addressing.
So addressing the fears of your clients or customers seems to be key right now. Here's a good example from Southwest Airlines, in the form of a Facebook ad they're currently running. Just like the cruise line, they focus on FOMO, the fear of missing out on a deal, rather than on health and safety. And on that topic, we asked Brian about what the airlines should be saying in the marketing right now, during the pandemic. The first thing he told us was, when it comes to health and safety, don't sugarcoat it.
In the current environment, you can't sell crap that isn't true. So I cannot convince people that flying is safe unless it actually freaking is. Okay? That's the reality of the situation. Okay? So the public health crisis has to be solved first. And then the airlines can rebuild trust.
That's a fair point. So businesses in the travel industry obviously can't change the way things are right now. The best they can do is address the factors within their control, like prices and cleaning standards. You can see from this graph that since commercial flights practically came to a halt when the pandemic started, demand has climbed back up a little bit. But the journey back towards trust and safety and normalcy will happen little by little, and businesses in this industry need to expect that. So of course, those businesses that can pivot for the time being should do so. Next, we asked Brian how he's pivoted in his own agency, and he told us that now he's focusing more on a different segment of aviation clients, business travel rather than commercial.
We think that market is on life support for the next 10 years, but hey, knock yourselves out. So we pivoted. We pivoted to business. We pivoted to general aviation. Okay, we pivoted away from A&D, aerospace and defense, to general and business aviation. Okay, we think that has panned out well for us, and it continues to drive our inquiries and leads and things like that.
When Brian says business aviation, he's basically talking about private jets, like for Oprah, or the Kardashians, or major global corporations. So basically, any shift your travel company can make to actually reduce risk is smart. Because as Brian said, just saying that you're taking precautions might not be enough for your customers. That brings us to our last question for Brian. We asked him, other than this shift to business and corporate aviation, what else is his marketing agency doing to pivot during the pandemic? He says that he's shifting from highly personalized, client-specific marketing solutions to more standardized, scalable packages.
We got 3, suits on the shelf. We can tailor them a little bit around the edges, but these are designed to fit your primary problems. Again, if you go to our site and you download that coronavirus toolkit, you'll understand why. Which is this is a learned lesson of watching companies that start up in bad economic times or transition in bad economic times, and you have to solve the core problem, and you have to do it at scale. And so we transitioned from doing bespoke, custom, tailored work to doing mostly off-the-shelf work.
A good analogy would be dining in a restaurant. Restaurants have menus because otherwise creating a custom dish tailored to each diner's specific preferences would be way too time consuming and inefficient. Having a menu of options that will work for most customers is simpler and more manageable. So the lesson here for agencies is to keep your packages simple during this economic downturn, because it'll help you scale your clients and grow your revenue faster. Okay, so that was Brian Del Monte, president of the Aviation Agency. Thanks for joining us, Brian. If you're a business in the travel industry or you have clients in this industry, you can download that coronavirus toolkit he mentioned at theaviationagency.com. We'll also link to it in the description below. Now, before we move on to our next guest, let's take 30 seconds to catch up in the live chat or in the comments if you're watching this after the premiere. Tell us, what's your connection to the travel industry? Are you the owner or marketer of a travel business? Do you have clients in the travel space? Or are you tuning in as a travel consumer? Our next guest for today is Susan Friedenberg. Susan also has an impressive career history. Here are the highlights. First, she has over 3 decades of experience in the business aviation industry. She started out as a corporate flight attendant for Coca-Cola on their private flights. Then in 1999, she started a training program to teach others how to land that dream job so they can jet set around the world with interesting and influential people too. Today, she still runs this intensive 4-day training program, although now over Zoom. And 2 other fun facts about Susan. First, when she's not teaching aspiring corporate flight attendants, she performs as a stand-up comedian in Philadelphia and Atlantic City. And secondly, Susan has an impressive list of celebrities she's flown with in her career. They include former President Jimmy Carter, Barbara Bush, Melinda Gates, Vera Wang, Steve Martin, Charlie Sheen, and Paul McCartney, among many others. Now, before we talk travel marketing, we couldn't resist sharing Susan's larger-than-life story about her time making margaritas and singing with one of the Beatles at 40,000 feet.
And it was so cool. I was in the galley with Paul McCartney, and he's teaching me how to make his favorite margarita recipe. And I would be willing to share it, maybe, if you email me. They're really good. And the other thing, he was so sweet. He was trying to remember the words to a George Gershwin song, and he couldn't remember the lyrics. And he went, "Susan Love, do you know the lyrics to this song?" And I said, "No, Paul." He made me call him Paul. "No, Paul, but my mother would, because she sang to the troops during World War II in Army hospitals. She knows every George Gershwin song." And so I think the song was "I've Got Rhythm." And he called my mother from the airplane, and my mother sang to Paul McCartney. And then Paul said, "Thank you so much, Phyllis. Can I call you Mum?" And my mother was screaming. My mother was freaking out, I have to tell you. And then my mother wanted him to sing it to her. So he sang the song back to her. So that is my favorite person that I ever flew.
You know, I really love my job here at Chatfuel. But I have to say, that story makes becoming a corporate flight attendant sound pretty awesome. Now, back to our topic of travel marketing during the pandemic. As we heard from Brian, commercial airlines, or similar businesses, can't fully regain customer trust until the pandemic is truly behind us. That's why private aviation companies, or businesses that can pivot to focus more on this sector, have an advantage right now. One advantage is cleanliness. Susan explains how much exposure to germs average person has as they move through a commercial airport.
When you arrive at the terminal flying commercially, from the time you get out of your car until you board that aircraft, you have touched or been very close to 680 touch points, approximately, okay? That's dangerous.
Yeah, I feel like going through an airport right now would be the equivalent of that scene in Elf where Will Ferrell picks that wad of somebody else's gum off a dirty subway railing and then starts chewing on it. So we asked Susan to tell us a bit more about how flying private during the pandemic gives businesses who offer that service a competitive advantage. We wanted to know what talking points can these companies use in their marketing to instill confidence in consumers.
If you're flying on a private jet, you show up at the FBO, which is called a fixed base operator. That's the private terminal on an airfield that our jets come into. So you pull up to the FBO in your car, and the pilot meets you in the little terminal. They're beautiful little facilities just for private aviation. So you show up, the pilot meets and greets you. He takes your bag or whatever your luggage is, he carries it out to the aircraft, and you board. That's it.
So it's easy to see the points that a private aviation company could highlight in their marketing. First, of course, they can mention how few touch points there are in the boarding process. That helps address consumer fears of health and safety during the pandemic. Second, they can talk about how stress-free and luxurious the process will feel. The peace of mind and relaxation that comes with this experience is a strong selling point too. Here's an example of an ad from a private aviation company that specializes in helicopters. It's a great example of focusing on consumer health and safety first. That was the topic of our next question for Susan too. We asked her, how can businesses in the travel industry address concerns about social distancing in their marketing?
On a private jet, the average passenger load is 3 to 4 people. Think about a commercial airline. So many people, 50 to 300 people. There's no way you can social distance. They had discussed taking out the center seat, but then they have not. They do not want to do that. So even if they did take it out, you're still too close to the person next to you. And what about the person on the aisle? What about the people that get on a plane? And you see this all the time on the streets. Their masks are below their nose. And if somebody sneezes, everybody's going to go crazy. On a private jet, usually it's a family or your best friends, and you can trace where everybody has been. But you can't do that on a commercial airline.
I feel like the only circumstance in which I would fly commercial right now is if I had a complete protective outfit from head to toe. Kind of like those really innovative shoppers at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure you've seen some of them. There's someone with full-on scuba gear and another person who has a gas mask and looks like the Undertaker. Now, I know all this talk about private travel might seem a lead and maybe even tone deaf during the current economic downturn. But actually, there are some apps and startups out there, like FlyXO for example, that make private jet travel more accessible to a wider audience. So if you're a marketing agency looking for some new travel industry clients during these times, there are some exciting opportunities developing out there, even in this market. Now finally, Susan clued us in on one more competitive advantage that private aviation operators can focus on in their marketing during these times.
And then there's the cleaning issue. We usually only do 1 or 2 legs a day, and we have the same people on. We might take them from A to B, sit for 3 hours, and then go from B to C. They're having a business meeting, and they're the only ones that have been on the plane. So our planes are cleaned once a day, and they are cleaned impeccably. The airlines might have 4 or 5 legs a day on that airplane. Their equipment can only be cleaned at the end of the day. That's not good enough. But what can they do? That's just the way it is.
That's right. What can they do? In many ways, the commercial airlines seem to have their hands tied until the pandemic is over. But for all you marketing agencies out there, that doesn't mean you should be sitting on the sidelines. There is still a lot you can do to sustain and even grow your agency and help your customers. Andrew will tell us more about this in a minute. But first, a big thank you to Susan Friedenberg, CEO of Corporate Flight Attendant Training and Consulting. Susan, we'll make some cocktails after the show in your honor. Cheers! Let's break one last time to catch up in the live chat or the comments if you're watching this after the premiere. We'll be back in 30 seconds with our 3 key takeaways from this episode. Stay tuned.
In case you were wondering, Italy is definitely top of my list for post-pandemic travel. I'm a big foodie, I love my carbs, so the pizza, pasta, my mouth's already watering. Now let's wrap up this episode so I can go make myself a bowl of pasta. It's not quite the same as jet setting to Italy, but it's the best I can do for now. So here are the 3 top tips for marketing agencies advertising for travel clients during the pandemic. And in fact, these tips are useful for any marketing agency, and most of them are applicable to businesses in general too. So here we go. Number 1, don't stop advertising. When airlines and cruise ships are losing business and money, advertising naturally seems like the first place to cut costs. But as Brian mentioned, those who continue advertising during an economic downturn tend to fare best at the end of the day. Even if you're like the cruise lines who are anchored ashore until October, you can still sell bookings in advance. Or at the very least, you can use optimistic and aspirational messaging to keep your brand top of mind. However, as Brian also so eloquently said, don't sell crap that isn't true. Number 2, provide marketing to business aviation clients. Data shows that private air travel is almost back to its highs in early March, before the pandemic erupted. Unlike commercial flights, this subset of the industry is surging. So as a marketing agency, offer your services to these business aviation clients to compensate for revenue you lost to commercial airline clients. Plus, who knows, maybe you'll get an all-expense paid private jet trip out of it? My guess is Paul McCartney won't be there making margaritas with you though. And finally, number 3, pivot from personalized to standardized services. Having too many choices can slow things down, whether you're the marketing agency providing services or the client trying to choose what you want. Standardizing and simplifying the services you offer as a marketing agency will make it easier for you to onboard new clients and scale your business during this economic dip. So that's a wrap. Thanks for sticking around with us. Join us next week, same time, same place, for another episode of Chatfuel School. Thanks for attending class today at Chatfuel School. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for even more actionable and educational content. And don't miss out on next week's class. Click the link in the YouTube description to get a reminder when we go live. We'll see you again next Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific. Happy botting.